Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. If you enjoy these podcasts, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron via my Patreon account. I release an additional weekly subscriber-only episode via Patreon, but also via Apple Podcasts, as well as bi-weekly Historian Unwrapped sessions, where I speak to some of the biggest historians working today about their lives as historians. From as little as £5 a month, you can access all content from the Tudor Chest. Just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. When we think of the Tudors, one of the first things that springs to mind is the fashion. From Henry VIII's codpieces to Anne Boleyn's French hoods and Elizabeth I's voluminous gowns, Tudor fashion is a huge part of the wider Tudor story and was incredibly important to the Tudors themselves, so much so that King Henry VIII famously introduced laws which mandated who could wear what and where. To discuss all things Tudor fashion with me today, I am thrilled to be welcoming an expert in this field, Eleri Lynn, onto the podcast. Eleri is a fashion historian and an expert in Tudor attire and jewels. She was responsible for the discovery of the bacton altar cloth, a piece of fabric which may very well have once formed part of a dress that Queen Elizabeth I wore. Eleri is, as I say, a genuine expert in Tudor dress and is here to bust some myths about the French hood, to unpick all of the different aspects that went into Henry VIII's most iconic outfits, plus much, much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 37, Tudor Fashion with Eleri Lynn. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Eleri Lynn. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Very welcome. So before we get into a discussion about your career and Tudor fashion, something that I'm really interested to know more about, just a few questions just to get to know you in a bit more detail. So can you provide people with a short intro into your background, so where you grow up and what you do full time?
Sure. So my name's Eleri Lynn, and I am a fashion historian, author and curator, and I grew up in South Wales. On a mountain between the South Wales valleys and the borderlands. So sort of, in the middle of, the industry on one side and then rolling countryside the other side. And I'm now living in London with my family. So, yeah.
Oh, lovely. I have to admit, I didn't know you were Welsh, but although your accent isn't particularly strong, I thought, I think she's Welsh. There's a hint to your accent that I thought, she's Welsh.
There is, and I think it's because I come from the border. So it's a very it's a sort of nondescript kind of accent. So it's not one way or the other, unless I go to Wales, and then suddenly, as I cross the Severn Bridge, there's a stronger lilt comes back.
You're all Wasakeren.
Yeah, exactly. Depends who I'm talking to. It can go full Welsh.
So what sparked your passion for Tudor fashion history, I suppose, Tudor clothing history?
That's a good question. So I think, I think that's really interesting. So I think growing up where I did, close to the border and close to so many castles, including Raglan Castle, which was a Tudor castle and manor, and a place where Henry Tudor actually grew up. And we'd holiday down in Pembroke, where of course he was born. So I think there's an immediacy to the history when you're surrounded by so many castles and remnants of the past. So that all seemed very immediate. Also, my mum used to she studied history at university, and though she didn't do it as a job, she would tell me stories about Mary and Elizabeth as if it was kind of like really current gossip, like, soap opera. She made it really engaging. So I always kind of was really interested on that level as well. And in a way, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in it. I mean, as a teenager, I had a poster of Elizabeth I on my wall, and which seems quite unusual thinking about that now. But it took me a while to get into the kind of dress aspect of it, and I don't think that happened until I got my first job, which was at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I was put on a kind of graduate training scheme, almost. It's called the Assistant Curator Development Program. And they sort of put you where you're needed and where you can get experience. And they happened to put me in the fashion and textiles department. And I happened to really love it. And I think that's where my sort of interest in, medieval and Tudor history kind of met with the material culture of that time and really sparked an interest. So yeah, I think that's kind of where it started.
I find if you grow up somewhere where it's sort of steeped in history, it does rub off on you. It sort of feeds. I mean, it's very similar to me. I grew up on the border between Surrey and London, and my childhood home, for example, overlooked Nonsuch Park, the home of the Lost Palace of Nonsuch. So it's kind of always woven into my DNA as well. I find that really does happen if it's quite immediate, it tends to sort of come onto you, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think there's something about the fact that that other people have trod the same pathways and walked in the same places as you. You can it helps you imagine it in a way that is quite unique and quite interesting, quite present in a way.
So if you could pick a single moment to go back in history, you can jump in a sort of time travel machine and witness something happen, what would it be?
Oh my gosh, what a good question. Right. So I think I would have used to have said the Tower of London to see what happened to the Little Princes.
Okay.
Right. It's such it's such a mystery. It's such a kind of big thing to solve. So yeah, if I could have been a fly on the wall to see what happened to them, I think I would have said that a while ago. But now, I think I would go back to the late Elizabethan period. So some people may know that I identified an altar cloth called the Bacton altar cloth, which I visited in a small church, the small church of St. Faith's in Bacton, Herefordshire. And sort of had a hunch that it was an item of, something really special to do with the late Elizabethan court, a fantastic bit of embroidery and textile. And I've researched this and spent hours and hours and, probably years on it now, trying to kind of place it in history. And, there's a lot of, I've got theories, but there's also a lot of academic doubt and questions about it. So if I could get the time machine, please, I would go back to find out exactly its story.
Yeah.
And then I'd come back and write a really, really kind of definitive article on it. And there we go.
Yeah, no, that would be satisfying for sure. It was.
Yeah, that would be really satisfying.
I remember when that discovery was made, and it was such a big thing, and we'll come to that in more detail in the sort of the main part of the conversation. But yeah, I can remember that discovery and it being so exciting because these discoveries are so few and far between. Especially with textiles and dress. Very little survives. So yeah, I think given the amount of time that myself and the conservator Libby at Historic Royal Palaces have spent with that object, it would be really satisfying to have a kind of definitive, this is what happened, this is what it was. So do you have a controversial Tudor opinion?
I do. I know I have heard other people say it, so it's not unprecedented. I know other people have said it, but it still feels kind of blasphemous and slightly controversial. So my controversial Tudor notion is that I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that Anne Boleyn did sleep with her brother.
Oh, that is
I know.
controversial.
Yeah, isn't it? Isn't it? But I have heard it before, and when I heard it, I I did what you did, which is to be really shocked and outraged. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, if she was really struggling to conceive, and if she knew that her future and her family's future rested on needing to produce an heir, and she thought that Henry wasn't up to it, then 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 maybe she would do it because she, couldn't be anyone else. Couldn't be anyone else. The baby had to look like a Boleyn, right? So, and it would be in the family's interest to continue her status. I'm not saying I 100% believe it. I'm just saying it's not. There's a grain of suspicion in my mind that it might possibly not be so crazy.
Okay, fair enough. I wholeheartedly disagree.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. That's why it's controversial. That's why I've never uttered it before, actually.
So to get into the sort of the main part of the conversation, the meat of the discussion, which is about Tudor dress and your career. So you mentioned you started out at the V&A. So where are you now based, and sort
Yeah.
of what does your day-to-day job entail as such?
Sure. So I started out at the V&A as an assistant curator and then a curator in the fashion and textiles department. Um, and it was, it's a fantastic job because for many years my job was literally getting things out for researchers and academics to see, which was an incredibly privileged position to be in because it meant I had exposure to so many fantastic objects over the years. And then there I ended up writing and curating an exhibition on underwear called Undressed. So that was really fun. And then I was the curator of the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection for many years at Historic Royal Palaces. So I was based in Hampton Court Palace, researching the collection there of 10,000 items of court and royal and ceremonial dress. And thereafter, I've been at National Museum Wales. At the moment, I'm actually in full-time writing and academia, which is really interesting. So I'm currently researching and writing, which is blissful. And I'm also a trustee for the Royal School of Needlework, which is also based at Hampton Court Palace. So that's quite nice. I get to go and wander through the corridors and the back rooms. So that's very nice.
Yeah, I think people. I mean, I'm going to be, we've got that upcoming part of a tour that I'm very much involved in next year, but I'm really excited to see the Royal School of Needlework because as a thing, I don't think people realise just how prominent it is and the massive role it played in the recent coronation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Royal School of Needlework is based at Hampton
Yeah.
Court. It has a considerable part of the back of the palace overlooking the formal gardens. And we have degree courses there. So people can come to the palace and do their degree in hand embroidery. But we also have a studio there that does professional fashion embroidery for major fashion houses, but also ceremonial wear. So absolutely, we had a major part in the last year's coronation. And what's fascinating about it for me is, as a fashion and textiles historian, is that the techniques that they're using are still the same that they were using 500 years
Wow.
ago. So the embroidery that they did on Charles III's coronation gown would be the same thing you might see on a coronation gown or a robe of state for, say, Anne Boleyn or Henry VIII. So it's really instructive and informative in that sense. And really interesting aspect of kind of not living history, but it is living history in a way, to see it actually still being done as a craft and an art form.
I know the King and Queen visited. Did you actually, were you there? Did you get to meet them?
No, I wasn't there. They came as a surprise visit. Actually, and so they came to see. So the Queen is actually the patron of the Royal School of Needlework.
Right.
So she's visited several times. and is really supportive. But yes, they came to see how it was sort of progressing, and it was really. I mean, I spoke to the people working on the robe, and they said it was a really nice thing because they'd been poring over this robe, these robes for months, putting their heart and soul into creating this work of art, this really beautiful thing for them. And they said it was like delivering the best Christmas present ever. They sort of took the paper off and got to reveal this labor of love and see their faces just sort of, kind of appreciate what they'd done and light up. So that was really nice.
Well, that's so sweet. It would be such an amazing moment to unveil that to the King and Queen. Definitely.
Yeah, I think it was.
To sort of Tudor clothing in particular, Henry VIII, when we think about Henry VIII, we think about that iconic full length by Hans Holbein. There's so much that went into his wardrobe. So can you talk us through the different aspects of, if we picture that image of Henry VIII, what were the different elements of the king's outfit that he's wearing? What are the different parts?
It's really complicated. It's a really it's a really difficult thing to unpick. And in fact, so I wrote a book called Tudor Fashion, and one of the reasons I put a chapter in there on the Tudor wardrobe was because I myself wanted to understand how all of these layers went together, these fantastic images that you see in the portraits, and all of these different textiles going on, and so. Yeah, in terms of what Henry is wearing, if we were to get him dressed for the Holbein painting, we would first put him in a linen shirt. So that would be almost like a kind of nightgown to our eyes. It would be a long linen shirt, which would be embroidered at the collar and the cuffs, and that bit, those kind of little frills of embroidery that you see in the portrait, that's part of the shirt. So that's the main item of underwear. It protects his body from the rough outer clothing, also protects, absorbs sweat, but also protects the outer clothing from sweat, because you can't wash those outer garments. They're too fine and too expensive. So the linen underwear, that's really vital. That's the only item of dress that is ever washed. And then on top of that, he's going to put on his doublet and hose. So that's, people have probably heard that, the phrase doublet and hose. So it's basically kind of his trousers or breeches, which go to the knee, and a doublet, which is sort of, like a little jacket that he puts on and he laces up. And he's probably...
Like a waistcoat, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be. It can also have sleeves. So, right. It can be sleeveless or with sleeves. And that's usually laced, because buttons are still not as used as often as laces. Zips, obviously never. They've not been invented yet. And so the doublet and hose, they're laced together to create a sort of, kind of put together onesie. And so on top of that goes a coat. And say for the, for a Holbein portrait, it's going to be a velvet coat or a very fine coat of silk. And that's going to be laced up at the front. And over the front of that usually goes a placard. So that's a sort of a decorative panel that covers up all the laces and stuff like that. And then over that goes a gown. And that's the bit that we sort of associate in the portraits. That the gown is the kind of top layer, usually trimmed with fur and so on. And in Henry VII's time, the gown would be long. But Henry VIII really liked his athletic calves and liked to show them off. So the gowns were shorter. So they finished at the knee. And of course, he also needs his silk stockings. So those would be gartered over the knee to keep them up, and his shoes, and then other accessories like sword belts, gloves, chains, office hats, things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it, and a lot of maintenance that goes into it as well, because all of these fabrics need, lot of tender loving care and upkeep.
It's just lots of different pieces, isn't it? Rather than sort of in modern day where we pull on our trousers, we put on a jumper. This was just lots of different individual bits. It must have been very hot as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was very warm. So, I mean, they made, concessions to it. So in the summer, they might have worn lighter fabrics, and in winter it would have been wool. But actually, we know that in the 16th century, in the 1530s and 40s, there was a mini ice age, or well, it's called that. It was a couple of degrees colder than the average temperature. We know from, Italian delegates, Cardinal Campeggio, who came over to try and negotiate the divorce or hear out the terms of, kind of the negotiations for the divorce between between Henry and Catherine, that he said, it's not uncommon for people to have their fires lit in June.
Mm.
So it was cold. So actually, all of these layers were very helpful in keeping you warm. They're all natural fabrics, so wools and linens that are very good at kind of regulating in your body temperature and keeping you warm.
Yeah.
So so it's lots of different layers, absolutely.
So one of the things that Henry VIII introduces is something called the Sumptuary Laws. What was this? Who did it affect? What were the parameters around the Sumptuary Laws?
So it kind of affected everyone. So they're not a new thing to Tudor England. There had been sumptuary laws through the Middle Ages, and it was about regulating what people could wear in terms of imports. So it was about regulating that people should wear domestic wool. It was about maintaining the domestic wool trade. What I find fascinating is that Henry definitely takes this, he shifts this into a different gear. It's obviously incredibly important to him. So the first act that he passes of his government in 1509 is an act of apparel. So that's the Sumptuary Law. And that's the act against the wearing of costly fabrics. And this basically codifies in law what everyone's allowed to wear, from the king right on down. So only the king and his immediate family are allowed to wear cloth of gold or cloth of purple. So that's why purple is such a royal colour. Earls and the very upper echelons of the aristocracy are allowed to wear a little bit of cloth of gold in their doublets. Anyone below the rank of lord is not allowed to wear imported wool. So this is where you see that protectionist kind of trade element coming into it. But it also goes beyond that, because there's government officials are allowed to wear certain things that the rest of the population are not. Lords and people who have a certain amount of money or income from their lands every year, they're allowed to wear different colours like crimsons or blues and things like that. So everything's very codified. So if you're wearing something above your station, people will be able to see that immediately, and it's punishable. It's punishable by a fine or a stint in the stocks. So it's maintained. I think it's really interesting, particularly after the war. So the roses, that these laws are so detailed, and I think that's something to do with making sure that the hierarchy is maintained, that there's no competition. And I think the Tudors always felt slightly nervous on the throne. And so for them, maintaining hierarchy and status was all important. Basically, you should know at one glance when the king walks into the room, there's no doubt that it's the king. And in fact, we know that several acts of attainder against lords often included a clause that they had dressed too finely. And in fact, one of the lesser known charges against Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn was that they had laughed at the king's clothes. So it's taken very seriously. Interestingly, it didn't affect women until the early years of Elizabeth's reign. So Elizabeth was the one who said, okay, now sumptuary law affects women as well. And so clearly it's more than just about protecting the domestic wool trade. Clearly it's about having no competition at court. There's only one boss, and she looks like this.
One of the things I've often wondered with, and forgive me if this sounds really ignorant, but with cloth of gold, we're talking about actual metal, made into material.
Yes.
Would it have made, if you were wearing something that had a lot of cloth of gold, would it have made sitting down challenging? Would clothing have been sort of bent out of shape as such? Does that make, or am I sounding really stupid?
No, no, no. It's a really good question. So it's not very rarely is it all gold.
Okay.
So it's usually woven with silk. So cloth of gold is still woven with a silk. So it moves like a fabric. It's heavy, but it moves like a fabric. And this is where you hear when you hear terms like crimson cloth of gold, that's because it's woven with a crimson silk.
Mm.
And so it is heavy, and certainly you wouldn't want to tarnish it. For some very special religious or ceremonial occasions, you might have it woven with a bit more gold, but you wouldn't be able to wear it for very long. You wouldn't. It would be difficult to manage. Yeah, and but it is, the cost of it is not just because of the precious metals. It's the fact that so much labor has gone into it, because
Mm.
cloth of gold is gold bullion beaten down into a really, really thin, fine foil. Well, not quite foil. In it beaten down and then cut into very, very thin strips and woven with silk. So the
Mm.
expertise and the labor required to just get it onto the loom is already astronomical.
Yeah.
And it was beyond the reach
Remarkable,
of,
really.
yeah, I mean, beyond the reach of mortals. In fact, kind of most of the aristocracy couldn't afford this anyway. So yeah, I mean, it's immensely costly. But also, I think one of the other interesting things I think about it is to try and imagine how it would have been in a Tudor hall when, it's dark and it's lit by torchlight. And everyone is they're wearing black velvet, fine materials, but, kind of, silks and velvets and things like this. And then the king and queen walk in and they're wearing this kind of cloth of gold. And the candlelight must have hit them like,
Mm.
they must have looked amazing. They must have lit up.
Yeah, it must have literally sparkled.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of Tudor. They're a Tudor glitter ball, right? So they're
Yeah.
just, kind of radiant in the space. And I think that's all part of it. It's the perception of this otherworldly image.
So we discussed a sort of moment ago about the fact that clothing was quite interchangeable. So am I right that in thinking that the women in particular, sort of unlike today again, where we would just pull on a jumper or pull on some jeans, actually the sort of senior female members of the nobility, the Henry's queens and so on, could really sort of interchange things, so they could effectively sort of take a sleeve off and replace it with a different one, and because everything was pinned together, rather than having an outfit, you could sort of pick and choose
Yeah.
from different fabrics and patterns and so on to create a whole new look, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the inventories of the wardrobes, things are listed by items. So Jane Seymour, for example, had 64 pairs of sleeves. And it's entirely so that an outfit can be made to look different and is kind of mix and match. So often they would match the skirts, but not always. And so it's about refreshing an outfit, having different items that you kind of put together to create a different appearance. So part of that is that dress was incredibly important in the perception of wealth of the nation. So ambassadors to the court would write lengthy letters back home about what people were wearing at court.
Right.
And they noted if somebody wore the same thing twice, because it had an impact on the sense of majesty of the court, but also hinted at the fact that, oh, maybe they can't quite afford to maintain a costly wardrobe. If they can't do that, maybe they can't maintain a costly army. So it's kind of it's a bit of a tell about the state of the nation in Tudor eyes. So it was a really good way of making sure that outfits always look new, always look different. Elizabeth I particularly utilized this. So she would send her clothes back to the royal wardrobe frequently for refreshing, or what they would call a freshening up, where they would perhaps add, they'd move the pearls around, they'd move the embellishments around to keep customizing it and making it look like a different outfit, particularly because she was much poorer than her father. That's because he blew it all. He blew all the cash, and so she was a little bit more skint. So she had to utilize that mix and match approach.
And I imagine it also had a benefit when it came to the different seasons, because, as you went into the colder months, you could replace sort of the long silk sleeves with fur sleeves and things like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Really practical on lots of levels, and practical as well for storage and maintenance. Because, as I said, you can't wash these things. They're natural dyes and natural fabrics, and often woven with metal and precious threads. So you couldn't wash them. You had to spot clean them. You could dust them with sweet powders, but it was a way of making sure that. So if something did get tarnished, you could also swap it out without ruining the rest of the ensemble.
One of the most iconic pieces, I think, of Tudor attire is the French hood. It's one of it's a real sort of standout piece.
Yeah.
And it's closely related to Anne Boleyn, but
yeah.
And people assume she introduced it to England, but that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not the case. Although you're right, she's really associated with it, and not just in our time, but in her time too. So she made it fashionable, but the French hood had been around before her arrival back in England. So in the records, we know that Catherine of Aragon bought a French hood. So we know that, she had one, she was aware of them, and very possibly wore them. There is a famous painting of Mary Tudor, as in Henry's sister, and it's kind of reputedly the painting of her marriage to Charles Brandon, and she's wearing a French hood then. Now, the dating of that is traditionally 1515, 1516, and so that's often considered the first kind of pictorial example of a French hood in England. But we know that Catherine of Aragon had them around before that. I'm not sure about the dating of that painting because the fashion seems a bit later. I think it could feasibly be to mark, say, the Field of Cloth of Gold, when we know that Mary Tudor, as the former Queen of France, played a really pivotal role in those proceedings. So it could be a kind of celebratory piece for that. But there's lots of discussion and lots of kind of scholarly debate about that. So I think French hoods was certainly around before Anne came. But she did arrive at court in a very sophisticated fashion. We know it's documented that she arrived wearing lots of French fashions and that this had a big impact on the court. So it certainly was something that people associated with her. And in fact, so much so that when Jane Seymour was queen, she banned her ladies from wearing French hoods. She said, they weren't allowed to wear French attire, much to their disappointment. And they said, well, there's letters saying, well, we don't look as good without our French fashions. And I think that's probably exactly the point, is Jane didn't want them looking good. But it was certainly something she associated with Anne. So, it is still one of the reasons for that, it was the French hood was considered risque and sexy, because unlike the English gable hood, which covered the hair, the French hood showed hair and actually was kind of set back on the hair a little bit. So it was, considered quite revealing, quite sexy. So yeah,
and I think the irony as well about Anne Boleyn, people also will say, oh, she never wore the gable hood, which is also incorrect, because we know that she actually wore a gable hood to her execution, so I think that's something that people often mistake, that yes, she's very associated with the French hood, but she wore the gable hood as well because it was definitively English. And I think that
She
was.
did, and I think that's a really interesting time to wear it, though.
Mm,
It's really interesting that she would wear it, when her days were numbered, almost as a way of demonstrating her piety, um, and yeah, becomes a symbol of her piety and her modesty at that point. So yeah, it is really interesting, but yeah, symbolic also for all of those reasons.
as a piece, the French hood, we've seen it. It's had many, many incarnations in film and television. Often they get it very wrong.
Often it's something like a headband.
Well, it's
Yeah.
either, well, I mean, the ones in Wolf Hall, I was wanting to throw things through the TV because it was like this strip of sort of plastic with a,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, but, they get it very wrong. And it's either a headband or it's like a visor that's reversed into this great big
Yeah.
crescent. But actually, am I right in thinking it was actually several pieces, like outfits, it was several pieces pinned
Mm.
together rather than just being this sort of
Yeah.
big crescent?
Yeah, that's right. And for all of those reasons that I mentioned before, which is that, actually you want to be able to wash pieces of it. You want to be able to decorate different pieces in different ways. So the first thing is that, a lady would wear a coif, so that's a linen cap. Because obviously washing hair at that time is incredibly difficult. It's not necessarily desirable given the water quality. Um, so it's not something that happens very often at all. And a linen coif absorbs the grease and keeps the hair in quite good condition. And on top of that, then you have the frontlet, which is the kind of decorative band of fabric over which you then put the bonnet, and that's the sort of crescenty bit of fabric that's on a frame. So that then goes on that, and then you can decorate that in different ways. So usually the jeweled band or the embroidered band on that is called the billement, and we know that those are separate items because they're listed in the inventory as such. So when Catherine Howard married Henry VIII, she had decorated bilaments as gifts full of jewels and precious gems, and then of course you have the sort of the long the long fabric at the back, which sort of drapes down from the top of the hood, covering the hair in many instances. And of course, that varies in style if you're talking about the French hood or the English hoods, with the older hoods that are sometimes pinned up. So they're complicated pieces of construction in and of themselves.
Yeah, I've often wondered what was going through their minds, that decision that was taken with the Gable hood, where they would pin one side up but not the other of the two sort of
Yeah.
long pieces of velvet that would hang down the back. It must have looked quite odd if I hear them.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it does look odd. And what's odd is that it's preserved in
Yeah.
portraiture, so they must have considered it fashionable, and worthy of kind of marking at that time. So I think, yeah, it's a kind of fashion statement.
Are there any actual original French hoods or gable hoods from Tudor England that still exist, or are they all
Um,
lost?
they're lost, but the frames survive, or some of them do. So in the Museum of London, there are a few examples of frames for hoods, and they're just metal wire now, but they're in distinctive gable hood and French hood shapes, so we can
Right.
understand their construction. Yeah, so they're wire frames. And around which must have been built, kind of draped, kind of pinned over the fabric, so yeah, it's really interesting. You get to see the construction. So they must have been quite light because they're just these kind of frames.
It's crazy, isn't it, that none survived?
Yeah.
I mean, there must have been that if we think about the amount of noble women over the time, there must have been thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. The fact that none survive into the modern era, to the best of our knowledge, I mean, there might be one in a loft somewhere.
Yeah, there might be. Yeah, there very well might be. I mean, this is the thing. There's, the Tudor wardrobe is sumptuous from the
Mm,
descriptions and from the paintings. And the numbers of these things itemized in the inventories is incredible. Thousands upon thousands of items of dress. Um, and very few
Yeah,
survive, one or two.
it's
Um,
crazy.
and yeah, so even in the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection in Hampton Court, there are two items of 16th century from the 16th century. One is the Bacton altar cloth, and the other is the Bristo hat, both of which I acquired while I was there. But just illustrates, that's illustrative as well of collections across the world. Um, that very few things survive from the 16th century and before. More, it kind of the collection tends to pick up from the 18th century onwards. Um, but yeah, they're rare.
The Bristow hat, is that the hat that is said to the red hat that may have belonged to Henry VIII?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So what led to that assessment that this was a hat of Henry VIII's?
So it's a hat that is associated with Henry VIII, shall we say? So basically, it's as a curator
Okay.
there. I was approached by the Bristow family, who had had this item um, in their possession down the generations. They could trace their genealogy back to one Nicholas Bristow, who was an assistant keeper of the royal wardrobe. Um, and he was an assistant to Anthony Denny. He served for a huge number of decades, really, through the Tudor period, um, and and devised he devised a system, like a stock take system for silks in and out of the royal wardrobe. And basically, he sounds like a real bureaucrat, because he was like, no silks are to enter the royal wardrobe without the signature of N. Bristow. N. Bristow is to check all of these things. So we know that N. Bristow, Nicholas Bristow, was a
Right.
key player in the Tudor wardrobe. We know he was keeper of the little wardrobe at the Tower. That meant that he got first dibs on prisoners' clothing. And another item of clothes that apparently the Bristow family had in their possession going back were the shoes of Anne Boleyn. So we don't know. I think those were sold at auction,
Right.
100 years ago or something. So we don't know what's happened to them, but they kept the hat. They kept this hat, which they said had been that had been worn by Henry VIII at the siege of Boulogne and in the 1540s, and that when the city fell, he threw his hat in the air. Nicholas Bristow caught it, and it had been in the family's possession ever since. And it's a red tufted silk hat with a green feather and a jewel, a little silver button. And so they kept it in their possession. So, in some ways, whether or not it was Henry's is sort of irrelevant, because they thought it was, and they kept it in this kind
Mm.
of remarkably pristine condition, which meant that it was preserved incredibly well. They kept it in a wooden box, which kept it away from the light and actually limited the airflow around it so it didn't oxidize and tarnish. So what we have is a hat that is certainly dated to the mid 16th century, and that is certainly of the status to be worn at court. And so for me, that's
Right.
enough of a reason to acquire a hat like that, because of its rarity and its provenance.
Yeah.
The rest are really nice stories, um, that kind of come with it and add the color to the hat. So, the fact that the family, with the Bristow family, who had this connection to, who trace it back to Nicholas Bristow, who's got all of this stuff going on at court. He was the agent who was sent to clear out the house of Thomas Cromwell the day before Cromwell was executed. So there's poor Thomas Cromwell in the Tower hoping for a reprieve. Little does he know that the deed's already done. His house is already being emptied by Nicholas Bristow, who then takes back his clothes to Hampton Court and hands them out to the nobility. So he himself takes a good chunk of these fine fabrics and clothes, and Henry himself requests the garter robes of Thomas Cromwell. So Nicholas Bristow is a big player. And so what the hat does is allows us to talk about those stories, open up those stories, do the research. And so it being Henry's hat is conjecture, but it's good conjecture. It kind of Yeah, it's from the time. It's from the time. I don't think there's any definitive way of proving it, and this is the problem. Once the provenance is lost out of the royal collection, once you lose sight of it, it's incredibly difficult. So all you can do is piece together the evidence and create a case, but also have the academic doubt to say it might not be, or it probably isn't, but it is all of these things.
So, based on what you're saying, it sounds like there's a pair of Anne Boleyn shoes out there somewhere.
Well, they could be. Yeah, they could be. And this is the thing. So so the Tudors gave away, I mean, aside from the fact that, Nicholas Bristow got dibs on prisoners' clothes, the Tudors themselves gave away a lot of stuff because it was considered a princely virtue to give gifts of clothing. And so they gave away a lot of their own clothes. And so there might very well be examples of their wardrobe in stately homes up and down the country. But the provenance is lost. So all we have is the hearsay of those families who say, oh, this is, by family legend was associated with such and such. And there are countless numbers of examples like that. And yeah, most of them aren't of the right date. Some of them are, who knows?
I once read that Elizabeth I had over 2,000 dresses, although I suspect that's probably not quite accurate. How is it possible that so little has survived into the modern day? And with the altar cloth that you discovered, so that would have been at one point it was part of a dress, essentially.
That's my theory. Yeah. It might also it might have also been it might also have been something else. My theory is that it was a masking dress, but it might also have been at some point something else that was remade into a dress. Yeah, so but it's an incredibly rare thing to survive. I mean, whether it has a direct connection to Elizabeth I or not, it's still incredibly rare from that time. And just like Elizabeth's wardrobe and Henry's wardrobe, the reason is that textiles were valued so highly. Textiles and dress weren't kept for sentimental reasons. They were handed down, reused, repurposed, over and over. So they were bequeathed, they were given as gifts, turned into something else, turned into upholstery, turned into altar cloths, and the provenance lost in that sense. But that's because they valued the intrinsic value of the textile. There are several other reasons why the Tudor wardrobe doesn't survive. One of them is that we know that the Stuarts did raid the Tudor wardrobe and reused it. So we know that there are lots of examples of Anne of Denmark wearing very similar things to things listed in the inventory of Elizabeth I. Then, of course, we know that there was the Commonwealth sale. So in the 1640s, when Oliver Cromwell he conducted the Commonwealth sale, which sold the goods of the king. So that includes all of the stocks of textiles and clothes that were in the royal wardrobe. And we know that a number of ceremonial robes were bought by a goldsmith who probably bought them so that he could burn them and melt them to retrieve the melted down gold and silver bullion. So that happened with that. And then if that wasn't enough, the final thing that the wardrobe had to contend with was the fact that the Great Wardrobe, is actually a big warehouse and workshop bang in the middle of the city of London. And it was right in the middle of the area that was burnt by the Great Fire of London.
Right.
So it had a lot. The Tudor wardrobe had a lot of things to contend with to survive. Yeah. The best thing that we can hope for is that some of those gifts and some of those donations are still out there, and that we could find them one day.
Yeah. There must be stuff out there. There must be.
Yeah, that's I think so. I do think so. I think it's really difficult. The provenance is really difficult to prove. But I think as long as we see things that we do see as windows into the past, that's a nice way to look at it for me.
So I imagine as a historian of fashion that watching Tudor dramas, be it on film or television, must be quite infuriating at times when you see really massive errors with costuming. Is that the case for you?
Yeah, yeah, it can be. It particularly bothers me when corsets are tied wrong,
Okay.
because like the sort of modern way of tying corsets was only introduced in the middle of the 19th century. Before that, it was always uh, a spiral lacing. So that infuriates me just because because it's a really geeky bit of information to have. So I can always point it out. Um, but actually, um, I have been enjoying the sort of modern interpretations of Tudor fashion, such as in Mary Queen of Scots in the kind of film of a few years ago, where some of the clothes, some of the clothes made of denim and different kinds of fabrics, and actually, there's aspects that, although they're not correct, kind of capture the spirit of Tudor dress in some ways. Although the recent TV drama, was it Becoming Elizabeth, the clothing in that was spectacular,
Wasn't
and
it?
that's not surprising because that was made by the team of the Tudor tailor, who are experts at recreating really authentic Tudor dress. And when they had the young Elizabeth dressed in
The red.
red cloth of gold from the William Scott's portrait, I mean, that was just spectacular.
Yeah.
So I gave a little kind of round of applause in my living room at that point.
As did I, yeah, because the Becoming Elizabeth was the fourth of the Stars series. It was the Spanish Princess and the White Princess and the White Queen came before it. None
Yeah.
of which paid too much attention to detail when it came to costuming accuracy. So I was thrilled that with Becoming Elizabeth, it was much more authentic.
And I think one of the reasons that it matters is that it really mattered to them. Clothes really mattered
Mm,
to the Tudors, almost above any other kind of kind of forms of decorative expression. Textiles and dress were really foremost in displaying their majesty and their power and their status. Um, and so, it really mattered to them. And so I think, and you can see that in portraits of them where, there's hardly anything that isn't textiles apart from faces and hands. So, yeah, it is nice to see when it's done properly, actually.
I know costume designers, it's their prerogative to, if they want to shake things up a bit, but I do struggle when costumes are massively inaccurate because I just think it's easier to get it right. Look at the portraits, look at the records. And it was one of the big reasons why I really struggled with the Tudors, the TV series,
Oh,
was
yeah.
not only the inaccuracies in the storyline, but just the inaccuracies in the costumes. I mean, I don't think I actually ever saw an accurate French hood across the whole or Gable hood across all four seasons. I mean, some of the things they put Natalie
Yeah.
Dormer in, I was just sort of hitting my head against the wall kind of
Yeah.
thing.
And they had Henry walking in a leather doublet with no shirt on underneath, just like it was a kind of
Yeah,
waistcoat. And yeah, that was that. Yeah, there were aspects of that were hysterical. That's for sure. Um,
yeah.
yeah, and it is interesting because I think if a costume designer understands has researched the period and chooses to take an interpretation to kind of project it or kind of interpret it for modern eyes, I think that's one thing. But as you say, just not to do the research when there's so much evidence there is
Mm.
it's a shame because
Feels lazy.
because it mattered,
Yeah.
it really mattered to the Tudors. I mean, the one thing that I do find, I always try and keep an open mind because although there's a lot of evidence in the portraits, um, is not necessarily representative of the full wardrobe. And actually, in the inventories and the receipts and the warrants, there are some kind of quite amazing things. So, Catherine Parr, for example, she loved Italian hats and Italian shoes. And, some of the descriptions are, kind of bonkers, of different colors and different fabrics and, kind of tufted yellow Italian hats and things like that. So there's always part of me that thinks, there's an untapped mind there of really, really creative interpretation.
Yeah, and with Catherine Parr in particular, she does sort of stand out from the other five wives. When we think about that most famous portrait of Catherine Parr, she's wearing what is actually quite a masculine outfit in many respects, because she's got that like bonnet type hat with the feather, and she's got a puffed sort of like almost jerkin style outfit. Very, very different to the other five wives. Now, we know from other portraits of Catherine that she also wore the more traditional French hoods and the sort of... But yes, it's interesting that she is depicted in that outfit. And based on the trailer from Firebrand that's coming out soon, they actually include that particular outfit in the film.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And, there is a really interesting element of trying to decipher the Tudors' personalities or the Tudors' inner emotional lives through their dress. And that's something I've spent quite a lot of time trying to research and write about. And, certainly Catherine Parr, she was, I think we're all now past seeing her as a nurse, kind of this spinster kind of, or an old nurse. We're now in a phase where we can appreciate her as an educated, scholarly woman. But it's also really interesting that she also clearly chose to express herself in different ways through her purchasing power as a queen, and to kind of patronize different merchants and different styles and things like that. So there's aspects that, kind of trying to decipher what the differences between the queens via their wardrobes. And there are definitely differences there. They're subtle, partly because the queen's wardrobe was a kind of, an asset of state and actually got handed down. So they were wearing their predecessors' clothes and jewels in a great number of cases. But when they did have the power to procure their own things, what were they buying and how were they spending? And that's quite interesting.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with the jewels as well is that the jewels can sometimes give us a clue as to who the sitter of a portrait might be. Because, there's that miniature by Holbein that might be Catherine Howard. Some people now think might be Anne of Cleves. And I believe the sort of conclusions are because of the jewels that's the sitter is wearing, because they tally very, very much with the famous Holbein of Jane Seymour. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so the jewels, because they're written, there's a receipt for them, and they match the descriptions. And so the good thing, the very helpful thing, is that the Tudors were very good at writing down details, just like Nicholas Bristo wrote down a lot of stuff. So even in the absence of the material evidence and of sometimes the pictorial evidence, we've got the written evidence. And when you can match those two things up, then it becomes incredibly interesting. And, sometimes in those little tiny receipts, there are absolute nuggets of fantastic information. So Anne Boleyn's debut at court, for example, is registered in a textile, in a wardrobe receipt for the revels. So, her first appearance was for a court pageant, and she danced as, what was it? Perseverance. Yeah. But that's the first documented bit of that's her first documented appearance at court, is in the receipt for the outfit that she wore. And so, there's lots of things in there, if you look, that you can match up and can kind of give you some nice clues.
It's often these sources that allow us to fill in the gaps as well. And, you know, one of the really useful tools that I discovered when I was writing, I've got a book coming out about the Pole family, and what's a really useful tool for figuring out whether someone was in favour is looking at the New Year's gifts and whether they're being sent or returned. You know? So these little details actually might seem inconsequential on paper, but actually have quite big significance.
Yeah, absolutely. And and a huge significance to the Tudor mind, because Margaret Pole was condemned on the discovery of kind of cloths, you know, with her showing her Plantagenet lineage, but that was considered too much of a kind of heraldic competition. So, you know, the symbols of textile and dress were taken very seriously.
So, final question, are you able to tell us what you're working on at the moment? You mentioned earlier that you're writing and researching, so are you able to tell us what you've got coming up?
Yeah, so I'm deep in the research at the moment for a book that I'm writing on the relationship between fashion and power, fashion and politics in Britain. And I'm starting with the Tudors and coming right up to present day to show the development of how fashion has shaped, I suppose, the ruling or political elite through the centuries. Now, for a very long time, of course, the political elite and the ruling elite and the crown were all kind of almost one and the same. And so, Tudor sumptuary law is going to feature in that, about how distinction and hierarchy was codified, and then how it kind of permeates into modern society, perhaps without us realising, but it's still there in aspects of our daily lives.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much for coming onto the podcast. Where can people, if they want to follow you across social media, are you on social media? Where can people find you?
I am, but I'm a bit slow. I'm a bit late to the party. So I have just an Instagram page, which is Eleri_Lynn. And I tend to use it to post up, kind of talks or, snippets of research. So that's probably a good place. I should probably get a bit better at it, but that seems enough.
You're a busy lady.
Exactly. It seems enough for me at the moment.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you again so much for coming onto the podcast. This has been a fascinating conversation.
It has. Thank you so much for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. My thanks to Eleri for coming onto the show for what I think we can all agree was a fascinating discussion. A reminder that I also release weekly bonus subscriber episodes via Patreon and Apple Podcasts. Please also do reach out to me via Instagram or via my website, thetudorchess.com, with suggestions for podcast episodes. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again, and speak soon.